We are on the other side of Easter. We're looking back at last week's preaching, at last week's reflections, and of course, our central reflections about the resurrection. Jesus has come back from the dead. Jesus is alive. Jesus has risen. Whatever we want to say about the resurrection, of course, begins with Jesus, and so we did well over the last week to start there, to focus our attention on the cross and on the empty tomb. But now on the other side of Resurrection Sunday, we're looking back and we're asking the question, what does the resurrection mean for us today? What are we to make in our daily life of this narrative, of this miraculous transition from the cross to the empty tomb? What does the resurrection mean for us today? Resurrection is, of course, one of those big Christian words that we don't really often use in everyday life. Resurrection. There's, even if we look closer at the words, if we take the re away from the beginning, a surrection, is that a word? I'm not quite sure that we can define what this word really means, and we really only ever use it in the context of Easter. Does the Bible perhaps help us to understand a bit more what this word means and what it means for us today? Yet even there, the question about defining resurrection is a difficult one. In the Old Testament, there are a few scenes, perhaps Ezekiel's Valley of the Dry Bones, the most vivid one and the most horrifying one in some way. And there's also Elijah, who brings a boy who has died back to life. So there is this transition from death back to life. The New Testament is, of course, concerned with the resurrection, but as we saw in Mark's Gospel, even there, it doesn't seem to be a vital part of the first message about Jesus. The women run away in fear. In Luke and Acts, of course, there's a bit more attention to it, and then there's 1 Corinthians 15. But other than that, there's still a bit more of a scattered, of a working out, of a trying to understand in the early church what the resurrection means. One thing is for sure, that the resurrection is incredibly important. Without the resurrection, the disciples on the Emmaus road would have been left puzzling. Without the resurrection, the woman in Mark's Gospel would have run home and forgotten about the events down the road. Without the resurrection, you and I would not be sitting here. Without the resurrection, there would be no Christian faith. There would be no church. What would your life look like without the resurrection? So, if we think about it in those terms or not, looking back at the cross and thinking about the resurrection, we already realize that the resurrection is central to our life. Our lives would look very, very different without the resurrection. So what does the resurrection mean for us today? How are we supposed to think about this? And what understanding of the resurrection will help us in our day-to-day life as followers of Jesus? I think a place to begin is with Elijah and Ezekiel, and to say resurrection, in a very simple definition, means a transition from death back to life. But what does that look like? How does it work? How are we supposed to understand this transition? And I think our readings today give us a bit of a glimpse into that and help us to put some flesh onto those bones in the spirit of Ezekiel 37. Our first reading from Exodus takes us, of course, into the wider narrative of Israel being trapped in Egypt, and it is really a narrative of death. Remember that Pharaoh kills all the Hebrew children, that the Hebrew slaves have to work in deadly and life-defying conditions, and even the plagues that God inflicts on the Egyptians to liberate his people have a lot of death in them. The gnats, the frogs, the river turn to blood, and finally the death of Pharaoh's firstborn son. It is a narrative of death. And so as we come to the Exodus moment of God's people passing through the waters, Exodus 15 has to break away from the narrative and can only speak in poetic terms about what God has done in this situation. Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrow your adversaries. You send out your fury. It consumes them like stubble. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The flood stood up in heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. When God brings his people out of Egypt, out of this place of death, out of this grave, out of the south, something that's down, that's below the ground, he's bringing his people up. The writer of Exodus can only communicate it in these terms, that God is fighting a war, that God is fighting a battle, that God is pushing away the waters of death and letting his people march through them. We've become very preoccupied with the Exodus and how did the people get through, where was the water, the miraculous side of the story, and yet the Exodus text is giving us a picture of God fighting for his people. The basic message of the Exodus. It is, of course, about liberating people, but it is also about God fighting, about God bringing his people to new life. It's the creation of Israel, if you will. But this resurrection of Israel from Egypt onto the other side of the water is not an end in and of itself. As the chapter reads on, you stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. You have led in your steadfast love the people whom you have redeemed. You have guided them by your strength to your holy abode. You will bring them in and plant them on your own mountain, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your abode, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. The Lord will reign forever and ever. Resurrection with Exodus is then not just bringing people from death to life, but it is to bring people from death to new life in the presence of God. A life that is with God, that is in God's presence, that is lived at the exact opposite, the polar opposite of death and destruction. Psalm 18 takes us into very similar territory, into very similar waters. A very similar language of death in verses 4 and 5. The cords of death encompassed me, the torrents of destruction assailed me. It's again this water language, this destructive, raging waves that come at the psalmist. The cords of Sheol entangled me, the snares of death confronted me. In the Psalms, we often get the impression that the psalmist is already with one foot in the grave, but maybe it's better to say that the grave is already with one foot in his or her life. In the Old Testament, and I think in many ways still today, death is not just something that's on the other side of a line that we cross at some point. Death is a power, a force, something that invades life, that makes life difficult, that the waters that come over the shore again. If you live in the right parts in Manchester, you have experienced that, of course, in January firsthand. The waters of destruction assailed me. And our psalmist cries out. He cries out to God in God's temple. And God pulls him out of the waters, just as Israel in the Exodus, and grants him new life. And this is what this sounds like. The earth reeled and rocked, the foundations of the mountains trembled and quaked. Smoke went up from God's nostrils, glowing coals flamed forth from him. He bowed the heavens and came down. He rode on a cherub and flew. He made darkness his covering. The Lord thundered in the heavens, and the Most High uttered his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. The channels of the sea were seen, and the foundations of the world were laid bare. Are we to imagine God coming down with all this fury? Or is our psalm writer giving us a picture of what divine intervention looks like? When God comes into the life of his people and delivers them, that's what it sounds like. That's what it feels like. That's the poetry of resurrection. It's the poetry of new creation, of pushing away the waters for this one person in this psalm to be saved. Exodus and Psalm 18 are resurrection texts because they portray God as the Lord of life, who shows up in the created order that we dwell in every day, and who grabs people who are surrounded by death, who gives them new life, who defeats death and brings them closer to himself. The text of new creation, the text of new life, the texts of following. They're texts that are difficult to embrace, perhaps, difficult to translate into our day. The text of mythological imagery, of symbols, of poetry. But here, as everywhere else in the Bible, whenever God breaks into human life, that's what it looks like. You can only talk about it in poetry. It is something from the outside that comes and defeats those forces that cling so closely to us. Resurrection. We've seen a narrative about a nation. We've seen a narrative about an ancient king. And we get a bit of a glimpse of this, of course, in the Old Testament. But what does resurrection look like for me today? What does resurrection look like for me in my death today, in the areas where I struggle with despair, with disappointment? How does God resurrect us as we struggle with these opposing forces in our life of faith and in our life in and of itself? Of course, there is no reason to doubt that God still intervenes in the spirit of Psalm 18 for you and me. There's no reason to doubt that God grabs people from a COVID deathbed and sets them back on their feet. Many of us have experienced this, many of us have heard about this. And yet at the same time, for most Christians, I think that the resurrection looks slightly different. And I think that John 21, our last little passage, gives us a little bit of a sense of this. First of all, it's of course important to notice that Jesus is portrayed to us here in this chapter as the Lord of creation. He knows about the fish. He knows that there is more fish. And we get the same story basically that we get in Exodus. God and Jesus, powerful in control over life on this world. John 21 is a bit of a choppy chapter at the shore of the lake. A lot of different themes kind of woven in here about Jesus making a meal, about the significance of Peter, and the significance of discipleship. And how can it be differently? It's the last chapter in John's very, very rich and deep gospel, and he's weaving a lot of things together. One thing that stands out, though, in this chapter is, of course, the figure of Peter. And Peter, I think, in this chapter, undergoes his own resurrection in a way that is very telling to us. Simon Peter said to them in verse 3, "I am going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." On the other side of the cross, Peter goes back to normal life. They come back to the shore, and they have this conversation with Jesus, and he directs them to go fishing again. And as they pull in the fish, the disciple whom Jesus loved turns to Peter and he said, "It is the Lord." And when Peter hears that it is Jesus, his first response is to jump into the water and to swim out to him first of all. The point here is probably missed on us very easily because we're looking forward to days when we can jump into a lake or go swimming in the ocean. Whereas Peter shares much of the attitude to the waters that his Old Testament friends and most ancient readers would have shared, that the water is a terrifying place, that the water is a place of destruction and of death. And yet Peter, in this moment, plunges himself into the water. On the other side, Jesus meets him, but he doesn't just stand there and wait for him, but he has prepared already a fire. Again, the significance of this is easily passed by us if we read the text just by itself. The last time that Peter warmed himself at a fire was, of course, when Jesus was tried, and Peter stands in the courtyard warming himself on the charcoal fire with the soldiers and the servants of the high priest, denying Jesus betraying Jesus. That scene really starts a slippery slope for Peter, that coming to this point, I think it's fair to speak of Peter's death as something of a combination of disappointment, of a lack of faith, of an abandonment of faith, of a resignation. I'm going fishing. I thought Jesus was coming through for me. I thought Jesus was the Lord. I thought Jesus would deliver us. And then Easter happened. I'm going back to my old ways. I'm somewhat ashamed that I've associated myself with this person who let us down again. Peter's death, Peter's resignation, Peter returning to his old ways. And yet there's Jesus, the one who just came back from death to life. How does he bring Peter back to life? What does Peter's resurrection look like? It comes to us personally in the most delightful way. In one of the most beautiful verses in the Bible, John 21:12, Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Jesus brings new life to his ashamed and betraying disciple. Jesus feeds him. He takes care of his physical needs. He invites him to have breakfast. Strengthened and warmed, he approaches Peter, and in what seems like a private conversation, he asks him questions. He draws him back in. He tenderly asks him, and so invites Peter to discover what is left of his faith, to tenderly discover for himself where his priorities lay, where his heart is. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Are these the other disciples? Are these the fish? Maybe both? Do you love me more than your normal work life? Do you love me more than the people around you? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Yes, Peter, you know that you love Jesus. Peter doesn't come out with this language till Jesus asks him. It's over and over in the scriptures, from Adam to Elijah, to Peter, to Paul, to John, where Jesus and God ask questions, where they set people back onto their feet by asking them about their heart, about their love, about their care, and about their priorities. 3 questions that he takes them through. Do you love me? Yes, you know that I love you. Tend my sheep. A new mission, not just resurrection for resurrection's sake. As in the Exodus, God is resurrecting Peter. He's bringing him through the waters. He's drawing him to himself. He feeds for him. He keeps him in his presence. And he commands him to go out into the world as his ambassador, as a person of resurrection, as a person of faith and conviction, as somebody who has learned that he loves Jesus more than he actually thought he did. Friends, resurrection is something that we think about only once a year, but it is something that we experience on a daily, on a weekly, on a regular basis. In the scriptures, we get resurrection as something so very, very powerful, as God who steps in splendor and fire and smoke, who draws people from the depth of the waters. But in John 21, we also get resurrection as something very personal, very tender, a private conversation after breakfast. Israel, the psalm writer of Psalm 18, Jesus himself, and Peter and Paul, they all go through the waters of death to new life, as have you and me in our baptism. But we don't stay there. But we are asked every day again by Jesus, our resurrected Lord, the Lord of life, do you love me? Where are your priorities? Where is the new creation life that I've given you? Look at me. Look at me. This is how I bring you back to life. Not by whipping and forcing and working you hard like the Egyptian slave masters, but by feeding you and by slowly drawing you out in conversation. Resurrection is new creation. It is new priorities. It is a new heart. It is a new way of following Jesus. And in Peter's case, it's a way of following Jesus after the third question that maybe a bit ironically, maybe a bit shockingly, leads all the way to Peter's death. But it always ends in the same way. You are a new person because you've put your faith in the risen Lord. You are a person of life. You are a person who no longer need to fear death because you are called, you are fed, you are asked, you are drawn in, you are brought in by the Lord of life himself, who comes from the empty tomb and feeds us and speaks to us. And even today, as he resurrects our own faith, as he resurrects what is left after our own doubts, perhaps, over the last year, it says, there's more love left in you than you think. And the more you look on me and see what I've done for you in the Easter story, the more you will discover that for yourself. And the more you will be able to hear my call to you, not as a burden, but as a privilege and as your true life. Follow me, Jesus says. Follow me.